So a very positive, optimistic United States, led by a person who believes himself in a messianic savior-like role, Woodrow Wilson, engaging the United States in the affairs of Europe, which is odd when you think about just how distant we were from European affairs at the beginning of our history. And then the intellectual reception to those ideas based upon these various influences that had been in place 200, 300 years prior. I mentioned a Rousseau, I mentioned a Marx, but I want to take up in our last module or last section of Module 7, I want to take up the influence of Nietzsche and Freud and try to show how a European mind could have been shaped by their conception of the world. So let me start with Nietzsche, and then I'll move on along to Freud, and I'll try to bring into play what I think is a little more complex a picture than the one that I just gave you with Rousseau and Marx. Rousseau and Marx believe that the world will not be made aright until the individual alienates themselves to the general will. Okay, so collectivism, a broad collectivism, is going to lead us forward. What's Nietzsche's argument? Nietzsche suggests that there is one great villain of Western civilization, perhaps two villains, but the greatest villain in Western civilization is Socrates. Why? Socrates is the great villain of Western civilization because Socrates, first philosopher, makes the argument that the world can be understood. That as long as we reflect upon it in the right way, as long as we ask questions, we can philosophize our way to truth. We can philosophize our way to an understanding of existence and our being within that existence. So for Nietzsche, what has happened across all of human history is you've seen Socratic rationalism in one stage after another stage after another stage define the human experience. So when you move to classical antiquity, you move from classical antiquity to Rome, to the Holy Roman Empire, to the modern world, all you see is one succession after another of ideas that are trying to define the world that we live in. Now, you ask yourself, well, what's the problem with trying to come up with answers to what the world is or to existence? Nietzsche believes the more powerful the definition, the more powerful the answer, the more influential the answer we give to the parameters of existence, the less we actually enjoy existence itself, the less we actually enjoy being itself. What happens is we subsume ourselves to ideas about reality and justice and right and good so that we no longer live. So for Nietzsche, the best experience in world history is not the modern contemporary existence where we do what we're told because we've been given answers. The best experience in world history was the experience of the heroes of Homer's plays, the men who lived on the edge of civilization, not knowing what would happen the next day, the warrior who took it into his own hands to will victory for their side. An earlier day prior to Socrates was a day where men actually lived. To live is to will your existence forward. The more the world has become rational and reasonable, the less likely we are to employ our will. So Nietzsche calls upon his Europeans to do what? Start willing your existence forward. Start willing yourself upon the world. Don't give yourself prey. Don't make yourself prey to the answers of the church, of the state, of the powers that be. Actually exist and will yourself to power. Now, in an important way, that is tied to the theory about human life that is forwarded by the psychologist Freud, who was suggesting what? Something similar. Throughout the ages, civilization has imprinted itself upon the human individual, keeping the human individual from being what they truly can be. So here Freud's theory of human nature is likewise very, very important. Freud says that within each of us are three parts to ourself. The most native part to who we are, he calls our id. It is that inner willing part that defined us at the beginning of our experience. And Freud will also say that this is really kind of the beginning of the human species. The human species looked like id. It wasn't a rational creature. It wasn't a passionate creature. It just knew it survived and wanted to continue surviving day after day, year after year, etc. But the more that the world has become civilized, Freud argues, the more the id is covered with this rule and that rule and another. And who does the covering? Well, the new and most powerful force in world history is what he calls the civilizational superego. It's that part of our mind that fears that we've done something wrong. It's that part of our mind that we might call our conscience, where you do what you want to do, but then you feel guilty about it. And Freud says we ought not to feel guilty because that's kind of who we are at our core. So life is this kind of interplay between the id, which would live as we want to, right? So it has all these sexual impulses and other impulses, man as he originally should be, a civilizational superego imprinting itself upon that id, and then our consciousness, our ego, that is left in between these struggling forces, but more often than not, pays deference to the authority of a civilizational superego. So what do both of these things amount to for Europe in the 20th century? Nietzsche and Freud preach liberation from civilizational norms. Marx and Rousseau alienate yourself to the general will in the direction of collectivism. Nietzsche and Freud take off the power that civilization has upon you. Free yourself. So these forces are going to be defining the experience of many a European poet, literary type, theater person, etc. And the overall picture that we get in 20th century European high culture is one of collectivism and liberation that will go a long way to defining the European experience during that century.